going on? Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure, but I'm pretty sure it's in reference to Ebola.
For sure.
And how it was sort of a rampant disease that killed a lot of people, but it wasn't our problem, or like an American problem, and we weren't focused on fixing it until it actually came and started killing people over here, which in this photo is indicated by a racial divide.
Absolutely. So kind of global north versus global south, this horrible disease we don't really pay attention to until it affects someone of our socioeconomic, geopolitical sort of background. And it's cool that you took, maybe 30 seconds to explain a pretty complex thing, but there's an image that you might have not considered as a piece of science illustration. And this guy isn't a technically trained scientific illustrator or medical illustrator, but it's a piece of editorial illustration that's talking about science. So I would definitely put it into that category of, yeah, this is science illustration, it's editorial art, but it does a really good job of explaining a very complex part of health and globalization and global north versus global south in a quick visual that you'll probably remember much more quickly than reading an abstract or 1,000 words about the topic or a complex paper about the topic. So the old adage of a picture's worth 1,000 words, it's pretty much true. And the basic gig of a science illustrator is trying to bridge that gap of the visual world to the science world, and how do we communicate those issues across those gaps. Because I know some of you are coming from the med school or the world of science, and some of you are coming from the art world and the world of visuals, and they're two completely different cultures. And how we get them to blend is kind of the role of the science illustrators. So if we define what it is, very broadly, and you can see I like to use the word science illustration instead of scientific illustration. Scientific illustration kind of works more as an adjective of very scientifically illustrating something versus science as this thing, and we're illustrating concepts about science. So science illustration is the broad umbrella under which there are many kinds of subspecialties. Medical illustration is one of those. Entomological, botanical, archaeological, etc. We'll look at quite a few examples. So we really work to help illuminate and educate about scientific subjects. Everything from kind of editorial stuff you just saw to very highly technical, specific things that only a few people on the planet might understand or need to talk about. So from very broad to very specific. I say that science illustrations definitely need to be accurate and clearly define the subject. I had parentheses there, I must have not saved that version. In an aesthetic manner. So aesthetic is certainly a part of subjectivity. Certainly I like to think my illustrations are aesthetic in a certain sort of way, but certainly the purpose here is the communication piece. And if you're communicating, you've got to know who you're talking to, and you're acting as that bridge in between. So the idea of audience is key. So in a lot of ways, illustration is a lot more like design than it is art, because you've got a specific audience in mind and you're building a product, something to tell a story to someone very specifically. So that's a Dürer piece, 16th century German, who a lot of science illustrators look to because they like that realistic style. It goes back to a Western European tradition, and we'll take a look. So I'm going to start here by talking about present. We're not going to go past to start out with, so a little out of chronological order. Just to kind of build some vocabulary, tell you some about professional organizations. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. Then we'll go into the past, and we'll look at a wide array of stuff, and end with a little bit of future. I'm not a huge futurist. I don't like to be the guy who predicts what's going on, but I can tell you current trends about what's going on. There are a couple of professional organizations in North America that act as organizing and educational bodies for science illustrators and medical illustrators. The first is the GNSI, the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators. This is about, 1,500 people in North America. This is a loose group of folks. Some folks have advanced degrees, many don't. The commonality are people who like to draw and illustrate concepts that deal with natural science. So folks from working at the Smithsonian to freelance illustrators Well over, I'd say 3/4 of all science illustrators, including medical illustrators these days, are freelancers. So they're running their own studios. Very few are working in staff situations. 50 years ago, that was complete opposite. That the museum here on campus, the zoology museum on campus here used to have 7 full-time illustrators. The hospital had more than a dozen medical illustrators on staff. They're down to 0 full-time illustrators. The zoology museum is down to 1 full-time illustrator. A lot of the work is being subbed out in terms of freelance work. So that's the GNSI. They have a marketing webpage that any person can buy a page on this. So if you're interested to see what illustrators are out there and what they're doing, this is really driven towards the publishing market. That a publisher, an art editor, can go to science-art.com and say, hey, I need somebody who's really good at illustrating fish or beetles or whatever. And this is a place where they can find those folks. Similarly, we have the Association of Medical Illustrators, or the AMI. It's about the same size of a group, a little bit smaller, maybe 1,000 folks. This group is a little bit more exclusive in terms of most everyone who's part of this group has a graduate degree, an MS or an MA or an MFA in medical illustration or biomedical visualization or medicine or art as it's applied to medicine. There's only 4 programs left in North America now. One is, the oldest is Johns Hopkins University, Art is Applied to Medicine. University of Illinois Chicago still has a program. Medical College of Georgia has a program, and the University of Toronto has a program. The University of Michigan used to have a program, but it was folded about 12 years ago. And I was originally hired to work in that program, and I'll tell you more about that. The AMI has a certification process, so they actually have a continuing education program. The medical illustrators do need a little bit more training because you've got to get access to surgical suites and surgical procedures, which means you need to have human anatomy vocabulary. Typically, in my background and my education was going in and taking human gross anatomy and pathology and all of these courses with medical students and taking studio classes at the same time. So I'll tell you more about that. Yes, stop me if people have questions here. The Medical Illustration Sourcebook is kind of the scienceart.com comparative where clients, employers, publishers can come to and find different medical artists. So you can find that online too. Another subset here of a bigger group of folks, and this is probably around 400 or 500 people, is the American Society of Botanical Artists. Not all of this is didactic work. This is some aesthetic work in here too of people who like to illustrate plants. There is a fine art print collector group in North America, just like there's wildlife artists, which I didn't include because wildlife art is very rarely used in teaching purposes. But botanical art is often used in teaching purposes. So they're a big group too, or big is a comparative word, I guess. My own personal background, just to give you a little bit about myself, I have an AB in art and biology. I did a small liberal arts school for undergraduate, 800 men at Wabash College, dual degree kid. I went on to earn my MFA in medical and biological illustration from here at U of M. At the time, it was part of postgraduate medicine, which is a sub-department at the medical school. I graduated and went down to work for the College of Veterinary Medicine at North Carolina State University. Never thought I'd be back in Michigan, but a few years later I was hired on a visiting position in 1994. So this is my 21st year with you. So I was a visitor for a while, and then a tenure track position opened up. And when I came, the program was transitioning out of the medical school and into the School of Art and Design. It was a small department, medical school was cutting back, they weren't sure what to do with the program. So the School of Art and Design changed deans at the time. The dean of the School of Art and Design said, sure, why don't you come over here? I was hired at that time to teach at the graduate level, but also was given a mandate to start an undergraduate degree in science illustration. So for about 10, 12 years, we offered a BA or a BFA in science illustration. And it was a nice program while we had it going, but it was also phased out at the same time the Med-El program was phased out. So here's some of my work from working at the vet school. You know, part of my undergrad, I almost went to vet school myself, so it wasn't until I was probably a junior as an undergrad that I really decided that the art part of my life needed pursuing as much as the science part of my life. So published a lot of books, worked with a lot of vets, worked with a lot of postdocs. Yeah, wide variety of work, which was cool. We did some patient education stuff. We did, there's a book that was published in Japan. Early Max and early interactivity. We were training vet students on how to do radiological techniques. So that was all pretty new back then. Also did some work on using digital media to do virtual dissections to minimize animal use in high schools. So doing virtual dissections. I've done a little bit of this type of advertising work. I experimented with it for a while. It's not my favorite work. I don't do it anymore. So you've seen posters like that. And I've done human medical surgical work too, not as much as the veterinary stuff. And honestly, by choice, I've kind of transitioned out of the surgical medical world just because I don't have the time to collaborate with the surgeons as much. It's different. It takes some effort to collaborate with surgeons because they're so busy. So I like to work more independently. So my background in ecology and biology lets me work much more independently, and working with zoologists and botanists is a little bit more low-key than working with veterinary surgeons or human surgeons. When I came to Michigan, I partnered with the Detroit Science Center. They were revamping some of their didactic space. I got access to a room. This is actually about 10 feet tall and all in sum. So the room is about the same size as this room, and we painted a mural that's about 120 linear feet that highlighted 5 different North American ecosystems. So here's Sonoran Desert. So, you know, to scale, that goes up, I think this was almost 11 feet tall. So there's a Caribbean coral reef, and designed these so that they were interactive. So here you can see there's a panel. Here's a saguaro cactus in the Sonoran Desert, and its daytime pollinator is this white-winged dove. And you're able to open up the door and see, oh, they also have a nighttime pollinator, which is this Mexican free-tailed bat. So we had worked with a bunch of students to develop lesson plans, basically for middle school science kids going into the Detroit Science Center. So here's another one in the Sonoran Desert scene. Here's a kangaroo rat in his nest underground, and even some soil concepts illustrated. And then we open up a nighttime scene to see that diamondback rattler likes to prey on kangaroo rats. This was a huge project that I took on a few years ago. This is the biggest animal encyclopedia in print. It's 16 volumes, about 5,000 illustrations. To give you a sense of the scale of the work, if I was to do this by myself, earmarking 3 hours in illustration, which was pretty fast, it would have taken me about 21 years to do it. So I formed this group called Michigan Science Art, and had about 16, 17 folks working on stuff. So each of these illustrations you see were about a 3 hour, not 3 hours per animal, not 3 hours for that whole layout. Oops. So a wide variety of animals. I'll tell you a lot more about the animal encyclopedia, but I won't. So typical stuff like you would remember back to high school biology. Lots of mammals, very few invertebrates, very few fish even, mostly birds, mostly mammals, because that's what people like, even though biodiversity doesn't necessarily reflect that. So to give you a sense of process, a lot of research done over at the Zoology Museum. So this is in the bird division at the Zoology Museum. So here's a drawer of toko toucans. So I'd go over, take a look at them, get a sense of the shapes and the colors, work with other photographs and knowledge of birds from zoos and a lot of bird watching to reconstruct them. So there's that toko reconstructed and all of his other relatives here. Here are some Australian fairy wrens that are in the collection. So you can see they're kind of bird on a stick is what you say the study skids are like. And there those guys are reconstructed. So here's what a typical sketch would look like. So I'd work up a drawing like this with labels on it, send it off to, in this case, the poison frog expert, and I'd work up a color sketch, color painting, and send that off for approval, and hopefully things go smoothly and you keep moving, because you don't have a lot of time. So working on fish and reptiles, this is kind of what the wet collection looks like at the Zoology Museum. So the colors get faded, so you have to use other resources. Here's a deep sea anglerfish, which I was excited to be able, since I was in charge of it, I could kind of cherry pick the animals I wanted to do, and I picked this out because I was always fascinated by this thing, and looked up in the collection and said, wow, we've got 7 of those things in the collection, how cool is that? And I went into the collection trying to find it, and I couldn't find them, because I had in my head that this animal was about this big. And so I was looking for like big jars or a tub that these things are in. And about 20 minutes later, I found the jar that had all 7. And there's the actual size of those guys. So, fun process to work with folks all over the world, learn a lot. Here's another sketch. So, and there's the painting for that guy. Gouache paintings. So a lot of times you work with clients, so this is the kind of sketch you might get from a researcher. So here's someone who researches mud puppies, and that's their drawing. To help you along, and you use that in combination with some photographs and perhaps a dead animal to take a look at, and there's that animal reconstructed there. So some deep sea dragonfish, seahorses and pipefish. Yeah, we've got thousands of these. We can spend hours. Lots of beetles, and of course if we were doing it according to biodiversity, the encyclopedia would be mostly full of insects and beetles, but there were the 2 pages of beetles in the whole encyclopedia. Anybody know what those guys are? Yeah, they're mole rats. African rodents who have their teeth are external to their lips, so they don't get dirt in their mouth as they tunnel along, which is a pretty cool adaptation. All right, so that's a little bit about me and some of a little bit of the sampling of the work I do. So let's kind of dig back in the past. Certainly we can go back to petroglyphs and cave paintings and even sculptures 10, 20, 30,000 years old and see that people were illustrating the world about them. We can look at that very scientifically. Maybe we don't know exactly their purposes for illustrating or drawing. Certainly a lot of it has to do with food and hunting. We use them scientifically today. Certainly this kind of X-ray style is an Aboriginal style that still persists in Australia. But that drawing goes back at least 6,000 years. So the idea of observing and documenting the world isn't something new, obviously. It goes back a long time. And certainly when we look to European traditions, early medieval texts, as soon as we were doing woodcuts, we see diagrams start to appear. Ideas of nervous system and skeletal systems appearing in images. This is a Vesalius, which we'll talk about Vesalius in a sec. So actually starting to do some dissecting. This is an interactive piece that's actually in our historic library here on campus. So a medieval text that's actually multimedia. So you can pick up that flap and see underlying organs. You might have seen old encyclopedias. I mean, my family's encyclopedia that had the frog pages with the translucent images. Those are certainly science illustrations. Anybody know these illustrations? Anybody know who this guy is? Oops, that slide's out of place. Sorry. I shifted around. That's Vesalius. I'll get back to that guy, obviously. I misplaced that slide. So there's certainly a lot of Asian work as well. These are out of the historic libraries here on campus. So acupuncture, acupressure sites, medical texts. This is a Tibetan text. Blood flow. Here's Vesalius. So 16th century. He was wasn't Belgian at the time, but geographically we call him a Belgian physician. And he published this famous book, which was really considered the world's first human anatomy book. And these are the engravings that he published in there. So he was doing dissections, which was not looked upon favorably at the time. So he really turned them into more of an aesthetic piece here and there. he also did animal drawings, so we're getting kind of in that cabinet of curiosity period of Europeans venturing out into the world and collecting things and bringing them back to Europe as odd artifacts and curiosities. So here's an East African species of chameleon that he looked at their skeletons. Certainly plant use and medicine is well documented. A little bit prior, of course, you know, Da Vinci and all of his dissections, which were very illegal at the time. So here's the Albinus is our guy who does this. So this is the second major European book on human anatomy. Y'all seen this illustration before with the figures in front of the rhino? Does that strike a chord with anybody? What's weird? I mean, why in the world? What's up with like having a rhino in the background? Does anybody know? It's a pretty cool story, actually. That this rhino's name is Clara, and she was the first live rhino to make it into Europe. And it was a Dutch explorer who brought her back from India and raised her from a small rhino to an adult, and basically made a huge fortune taking her across Europe as a sideshow. Because prior to that, no one understood, you know, these mythical animals from Far East or Africa. So to see one alive was a huge, huge curiosity. And Albinus rode that wave of popularity because Clara was a superstar. And he was getting ready to publish this book, and what a better way as a publisher to publish a book than take the world's biggest celebrity at that point and embed her into your illustrations. So it'd be like, you know, trying to publish a book on heart surgery and putting Justin Bieber in the background or something, trying to appeal to pop culture. A funky concept, but you know, there she is again, and it sold. So he moved a lot of books and made some money off of that. Certainly a lot of traditional botanical illustration goes back to Linnaeus, and Linnaeus starting to describe the world with the scientific binomial nomenclature. In North America, we see folks like Audubon starting his work. Just about the turn of the century, he said he's going to illustrate every bird in North America. And he gets it published in 1829. This is what the actual birds of North America looks like. We have one of these on campus. It's actually the very first book that the university purchased. That book is now worth well over $1.5 million. But as students, you all can get over there and take a look at it. They'll pull it out, put on gloves, you can leaf through it. It's a pretty spectacular thing to check out. So Audubon's gig was very much, he was an outdoors guy with a shotgun. He'd go out, shoot birds, bring them home, wire them up, draw them up, and do color studies and make the engravings and have folks hand color them. A lot of you are probably familiar with this. This has been in publication for a long time. It first came out in 1858. It's still at press. Originally it was illustrated by Henry Carter, and those are the illustrations that I'm sure you've seen before. Contemporarily, they even have digital illustrations in there, so it's this wacky mix of very old medical illustrations to very contemporary illustrations. Some of the mineral collections around the world are documented about the same time period. Napoleon actually used to travel with illustrators. So like when Napoleon was in Egypt, he had a whole group of illustrators documenting everything that they saw. And we've got a set of the Napoleonic volumes over at the Archaeology Museum in Kelsey. You can go see those there, which is also very cool. Ernest Haeckel is an illustrator at the turn of the century and does this very stylistic, I'm sure you've probably seen these around before if you didn't recognize who he was. But he fills up the page and uses these dark backgrounds. So, biological illustrator. These things have a lot of market value now. You see them in print shops around, but originally created as teaching mechanisms to teach students about botany. There's our rhino again. I threw that in there to kind of show a different version of a rhino. Charles Knight was on staff at the Natural History Museum in New York, and a lot of our fascination with dinosaurs starts with his illustrations. And we've got a Charles Knight over at our museum. And a lot of this, he was hypothesizing without any real context. I mean, he was an artist looking at the skeletons and trying to figure stuff out. So this idea of these big lizards carrying around their tails on the ground and dragging them, that persisted for a long time because of Charles Knight. It wasn't about a scientific theory, it wasn't about the paleontologist saying, oh, that's what they do. It was Knight looking at the collection and drawing these things up in his imagination, what they would be like. And it took us years to work that out of the system of like, oh no, a T-Rex doesn't have their tail dragging on the ground. It's like this big counterbalance. And they use it much differently than what Knight had to look at. So, these big sauropods with those dragging tails, and we know that that's not true. So the power of the illustrator is hard to shake off. And we'll look at some other dinosaur illustrations. The human embryo from an embryology book, early 20th century. If we look at medical illustration in the U.S., this guy is considered the father of American medical illustration, Max Bradel. He came from Germany before the war, and he was working with a couple of surgeons at Johns Hopkins, and was publishing so much that he needed to train other artists. So he basically founded the first program in medical illustration, and that program is still in existence. It's called Art as Applied Medicine at Hopkins. He's a master at light and shadow. So here's an ovarian cyst with a lot of little cystlets in it. He uses a technique called carbon dust, also a very good pen and ink artist. So all of this is 1930s, 40s, 50s work. So driving towards book publication. These are all varieties of gallstones. So you can see he's using some pretty innovative ways to do illustrate medicine with cross sections and three-dimensional things happening all at the same time. A little bit more contemporary is Frank Netter. So if any med students in the group, this is a popular text to use. Netter's an American physician, actually an MD who was also a painter. Published this Atlas of Human Anatomy. It's since been updated and turned into interactive media, and you can get online and buy these illustrations, interactive programs. It helps med students learn their gross anatomy. Steve Gilbert is a Canadian who published a lot of North American dissection guides. So if you ever dissected a fetal pig in high school or college, Gilbert probably illustrated those. He passed away just a couple of years ago, unfortunately. Things like field guides, of course, those are science illustrations. Peterson is Roger Tory Peterson is the birder and painter that does all the Peterson guides. More contemporary is Sibley. So David Allen Sibley is kind of the go-to field guide. If you ever debate about, well, why not use photography instead of illustrations? If you've ever gone out birding before or used a field guide, you understand that the photographs just can't do the work that the illustration does. So being able to show all of these warblers in exactly the same position and highlight the differences is not easily done with photographs. So here we'll run through kind of some examples of different kinds of illustration. So archaeological illustration, this is kind of the typical sort of thing, and you can see that this isn't very sexy illustration in terms of media. It's pen and ink, it's black and white. It's because the publications that are publishing this stuff are really low budget publications, not full color. So using pen and ink is kind of the go-to. So doing cross sections and details and keeping things to scale is key. Certainly some archaeological sites are reconstructed by artists, so even though this could have been done by a wide variety of illustrators, there are science illustrators who specialize in these kinds of reconstructions. And certainly digital tools are used effectively to do this these days. Forensic reconstruction is an area of science sculpting that folks have been doing for a long time. Collecting data on how thick skin is on different points of the skull. So traditionally, folks would actually use markers and build these out with clay. This is done digitally now, scanning the skull and 3D reconstructing with things. So this is an actual sculpture but we can take a skull and scan it in. I mean, you've probably seen King Tut and reconstructed for National Geographic and the like. So that's all based off of forensic data that's worked back and forth between scientists and sculptor, actually. So we've seen illustrations like these before, of course. Entomological illustration is a big area of folks working. The Smithsonian does have still half a dozen entomological illustrators. That's a digital illustration done with Adobe Illustrator, believe it or not. Those are traditional. Medical education in terms of posters and medical sculptures is a big area of work. So you've been to the doctor before, and at the doctor's office, there's posters on the wall. Well, those come from somewhere, obviously. And illustrators are involved in that. Medical legal is another broad category of work. So especially in litigated medical cases where there's injury, medical illustrators are called upon to illustrate the injury or tell the story to educate the jury about things. And certainly, I've never done this kind of work. I wouldn't want to work with the medical litigators that are doing those kinds of personal injury cases. But lots of folks do this kind of work, and actually a lot of medical illustrators that are good at doing portraiture actually work in courts as court artists. Court cases that aren't allowed to have cameras in there, the illustrators will do the illustrations for those. Medical sculpture done for teaching models, those certainly exist. Here's our dinosaur section. So I think this was from Scientific American. But certainly you've seen the big maps that come out of National Geographic. Just to give you an idea about the illustration process for something like Geographic, they're so selective about the visuals that Geographic uses. A single illustration, one of my former students worked for about 12 years as an art editor there. And he said it's pretty common for an illustration to go through a 2-year period of production. So you're looking at multiple iterations. It's not like you just do one and it sits around. But 2 years of active work going back and forth and having multiple reviewers. So it's a complex process of working with a multitude of experts to get things reviewed and re-reviewed, and visual compromise and graphic designers, and so it's really a highly collaborative process for these bigger, more complex pieces, for sure. And so there is one graduate certificate program in the country out at University of California, Santa Cruz, that has a certificate in science illustration. But a lot of these folks that are doing this kind of paleo reconstruction stuff are folks that just like dinosaurs and have always drawn dinosaurs or enjoy that kind of drawing, and have started to collaborate with the paleontologists and find work that way. So that's how a lot of that work goes. And certainly